Welcome to the I Made a podcast, where we hear from podcasters about what they've learned since starting their own show, so you can do the same. And now, here's your host, Chris Creary.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of I Made a Podcast. I hope that you're having a good day. This is going to be a great episode. I spoke to Jim Salvucci, who has two podcasts. One of them is called On Leading with Greatness, and it's a leadership podcast. And the other podcast is called The Dylantantes, which is all about Bob Dylan. And this was an awesome conversation that I had with Jim. So we're going to get into this episode right now. But before we do, I just want to remind you about my podcasting cheat sheet. There's a link in the description. If you're not new to the podcast, you've heard me mention it before, but this cheat sheet has a list of resources that you can use as a podcaster, both software and hardware, of things that you can get to help you get the best sounding audio and video for your podcast. So there's a link in the description that you can get to this cheat sheet. And I call it a cheat sheet because most of the resources mentioned here are free. So get it from the link in the description. So now let's get into this interview with Jim, and I'll be back at the end to close things off. All right, everybody, thank you for tuning in to I Made a Podcast. Today, I am speaking with Jim Salvucci, and he has a podcast called On Leading with Greatness. Jim, how are you doing today?
Doing great, Chris. Thanks for having me.
All right, wonderful. So can you please introduce yourself to those who may not have heard of you before, and maybe introduce your podcast as well?
Yeah. So just by way of background, I'm a recovering academic. I worked in higher education for 30 years. I was an English professor, then I was an administrator, a dean, and a vice president at a bunch of different schools. You never heard of any of those schools. And I left higher ed and started coaching young people to become great leaders. So I work with managers who want to become great leaders. I also am a leadership speaker and an author.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah. Oh, so you're an author as well. You didn't mention that to me before.
Well, it's my blog is part of which becomes my podcast is part of the author.
Gotcha. Okay, so we're going to get into that a little bit later. So you actually have two podcasts, right? So There's On Leading with Greatness, and then there's another one that you want to talk about as well?
Yeah, my other one is a completely different thing. It's a hobby more than anything, and it's called The Dylantantes, and it is a podcast devoted to Bob Dylan. It features essays and interviews, and I do a monthly roundtable as well with some Dylan scholars. And there are a lot of Dylan scholars. I happen to be one of them. I'm published on Bob Dylan's writing.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, it's a big deal. It's a big area of scholarship now.
Okay.
And growing. But yeah, so we get together every month and talk about a topic, or we interview. I have somebody who interviews for me, and I do some interviews as well, just of fans and scholars and people we've met. People who are interested in Bob Dylan.
Wow, wonderful. Yeah, so this is kind of an interesting mix of two different podcasts that you have. So maybe let's get into On Leading with Greatness. When we talk about that podcast, who would you say that one is targeted towards?
Yeah, so that one is targeted toward, again, young people, people in their 30s usually, who are managers who want to learn more about how to lead. And, anybody else who's interested in leadership, of course, but that's my primary target audience. It is, as my personality tends to be, a little quirky, I'd say, very irreverent sometimes. I don't pull punches very often. You have to, otherwise you get yourself in a lot of trouble, but I try not to. And, I try to be pretty direct, and it's a little different than what most other people do when they write and podcast about leadership.
Mm-hmm. And then your other podcast is about Bob Dylan, right? So
all about Bob Dylan, and it's about the people who study Bob Dylan or follow Bob Dylan. So I've, people who have published books and essays on Bob Dylan, people who I've interviewed, I interviewed a guy, I met him outside of a Bob Dylan concert at a restaurant. He seeing Bob Dylan for his 303rd time that night. So and he's not one of the bigger ones.
Really? I would consider that. Yeah. I would consider that a super fan 300 times.
Wow. But he's followed Dylan around a little bit, and he, and so, I interviewed him. He basically said, "You might want to interview me." So that's what I did. I interviewed a family friend not too long ago, 19 years old. She went to see her first Bob Dylan concert, and that was I love that. That was one of my favorite interviews ever.
Awesome. Yeah. I think it's great that we have, like in your story, we have two different podcasts, both one that's more so on the entertainment side of it with Bob Dylan, and you can reach a different group of people in that podcast than from what you reach in your other podcast. But then it all makes up who you are basically, right? Things that are passionate towards you. And I think when it comes to podcasting, any podcaster out there, if you're starting, that's key, that whatever you're podcasting about, that make sure that you do it on something that you are passionate about, something that you love, that the fire for it won't burn out after maybe like 2 or 3 episodes, because there's a lot of podcasts out there who start talking about something and then it fizzles out after a little bit. So for your one podcast on Leading with Greatness, I know you have 104 episodes so far published.
Oh, actually, I have a lot more than that.
More than that? Okay.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's over 170.
Oh, wow. Okay. My number is wrong then, I guess. So, because I got this off of iTunes, it shows the number of published episodes. Maybe there's a limit or something.
Oh, I might not have been putting it on iTunes all that time.
Oh, okay. So how long have you been podcasting for in terms of like years or number of episodes?
Well, I started that podcast, I had to look this up, in May of 2021.
Okay.
And I do it on a weekly basis. Now, some of them are repeats. So like around holidays and things when people aren't really listening and I don't really have time to write stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I just do an encore presentation.
Right.
But I'd say later on, I'll be doing one of those later this month because I'm going to go on a little trip and it's just too hard to get something out. But, otherwise they're all, there's like 170 original ones there.
Mm-hmm. And it's really great. So you have 170 episodes. Now, in terms of your content creation, now we were talking about this just before we started recording on how you do your podcast. So you want to explain a little bit about your content creation strategy and where your podcast episodes come from on Leading with Greatness?
Yeah. So I don't do it the way other people do, apparently, for the most part, which is pretty typical of my life. So I don't interview anyone, and it's not me just sort of riffing. A lot of podcasts are people riffing, and those are great models. I mean, what your model's fine here. I have nothing against that. I just had started out as a blog.
Mm-hmm.
I was blogging about leadership, and at some point I thought, oh, it'd be really interesting just to record these blogs, and so I started recording them and putting them out. And then it turned out some people like listening, some people like reading, and then eventually I discovered how to, get the RSS feed out there and get them on, iTunes or whatever, and so I started doing that and they started getting a little more airplay. But it really is just this essay I write every week. It starts Thursday morning. I usually start writing. I write in the mornings and by Wednesday of the following week, I'm usually recording it. And then 2 a.m. the next Thursday, it gets published.
Oh, wow. So that's basically 1 week turnaround or a week and a 2 weeks?
Just 1 week.
1 week, right? So, oh, wow. That's awesome. So
a week.
So every episode is basically an essay that you're basically writing.
That's exactly all it is.
Wow. That's awesome. So, and then the process, wow, that's a lot of writing. I give you kudos for that, for doing that. Now, with regards to the length of each episode, I think the length varies again, probably because depending on how long the essay is. How long do you shoot for?
Yeah, I usually shoot for under 10 minutes. So I usually shoot for around 1,100 words.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes a little shorter. Usually it's a little longer. If it's 1,500 words, I really try to pare it down a lot. The one I'm working on now, I had to pare down a great deal. I have a Christmas one that I created that is pretty long. That one's about 15 or 20 minutes read. And it's a parody of Scrooge. It's set in the modern office setting. And a lot of my I involve a lot of my quirky humor in there as well.
Yeah. As I was listening to your podcast, I heard some of that humor. It is pretty funny. So which podcast do you like doing better, or is it a tie? You don't have to answer that if you don't want to, but which one do you enjoy doing the most?
I don't want to offend either one of them. I probably enjoy on Leading with Greatness because I've been doing it longer. I have more control over it. The Dylantantes is a lot more complex.
Right.
Like I said, I have a partner, a friend of mine does some of the interviews. Originally, the Dylantantes was conceived as a platform for people to publish their writing and their recordings and things they wanted to do. So it started out, I thought it'd be more people doing essays and reading them. And it turned out I was the only one doing that at first. And then we started getting into interviews. And then we started doing this roundtable every month as well. And that became wildly popular.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually now part of the podcast network. But it's harder to do because I've got to like nail down the interviews and all that. It's not just me, and I've got to think ahead, which is a little hard. So I haven't gotten into a good cadence with that. So yeah. I do definitely prefer the other one.
Yeah. So I think that's one of the things that as podcasters, if we can get into that routine or that cadence with how you're producing your content, once you can get into that rhythm, things start to flow a little bit easier. But it's finding that rhythm and kind of sticking to it. And if you're doing a podcast where you are interviewing other people, or where there are other elements involved or other people involved, their schedules might kind of throw things off a little bit. But yeah, once you find that rhythm, it's good to kind of continue to go with the flow. Now, what would you say is the best episode that you've ever done, or most downloaded episode of either podcast?
In terms of on Leading with Greatness, there was one I did called, it was a while ago, a few years ago, and it was called, oh geez, I looked it up and now I've forgotten. Oh, but I worked so hard on it. And it was about how people act like, and I used to see this when I was a teacher. People act like, oh, I worked really hard on this, so I should get a good grade. Oh, I worked really hard on this, so it must be good. Mm-hmm. And it was arguing that it isn't the amount of work you do on it or the effort you put into it. It's actually the quality of the piece, right? Mm-hmm. And it wasn't my best piece, not by a mile. But I was working with a coach at the time, and she sent it out for some reason, just at random, sent it out to her mailing list. And it got like over 1,000 downloads.
Oh, wow.
Mailing list.
Wow.
I've never had anything even close to that. I mean, not even close. But it was, and I was a little embarrassed because I was like, this is not my best representation here. You could have chosen the week before or the week after. Those were significantly better. Every now and then you don't have the crispest writing or anything like that. But and I think my writing's gotten a lot better too. And I will tell you this, I'll confess to something. I've started using AI with my writing.
Interesting. Okay, so that brings up a good question though. Mm-hmm. So you used it for your writing, and confession time for me as well. When it comes to planning my podcast, I use Chat GPT to get kind of topics and stuff like that as well. But so you used it for your writing, some of your writing. How do you work other aspects of AI into your podcasts? What other tools do you use, or if there are any tools, or have you thought about it?
Yeah. So I've been experimenting with an editor called The Script, which is an AI editor. Everybody enhances the sound and whatnot. And if you're doing video, it also keeps people's eyes focused on the camera, which is really good. And I like that. I need to learn more about it. I've used it quite a bit, especially for the Dylantantes.
Yeah.
I've been recording because we do roundtables and things on Zoom, and it's a lot easier. And, when you're doing an interview podcast, as you well know, you're at the mercy of the other end, right? Whatever's going on. And I'm interviewing, when I'm doing my roundtable in the Dylantantes, there's 5 other people, and you don't know where they're at. Like one of them always does it in the cafeteria somewhere in the college. There's like people walking by. The sound can be really bad. And using something like that is great because it's I just don't have the acumen to do that myself.
Yeah, that's actually a tool that I use as well. So one of the things that so this has been great, like this podcast that I've started, because like I have learned like so much from other podcasters. There are a lot of tools. So The Script was one of them that I learned from someone that I spoke to. I never heard about it before I started this podcast. And there was another tool called Alphonic that cleans up background noises and stuff like that from your audio, just makes it nice and clean, almost similar to what The Script does with the studio settings. But what I did was create like a cheat sheet for everybody. And it has all of these resources, online resources, and it has some hardware as well that you can get at a good price. But like anything that anyone could need to start a podcast or to get better quality out of their podcast, I put it on this cheat sheet. So I have it in a link in the description for this episode. So if anyone listening right now, if you want to get it, you can get it in the link, and maybe I'll send it to you, Jim. And you can like take a look at the list of apps that I put on there, because there's a lot of good ones. I think it's called 1, 2, 3 free apps or something. I can't remember the exact name, but this one hub has a whole bunch of free apps that podcasters can use to transcribe audio, to edit audio, to cut audio, to convert the audio format, to do a whole bunch of things that will help you get better audio. And it's all free, right? So I'll send you the link after, and you can check it out.
Yeah,
but I would encourage everyone to get that cheat sheet. Again, the link is in the description. So Jim, can you tell me, like, in terms of promotion for your podcast, both of them, how do you promote your podcast?
very different. So on Leaning on Greatness, yeah, I've kind of bifurcated the thing. I'm not sure this is the best idea in terms of counting who's listening and paying attention, but I recently started a LinkedIn newsletter that is just my On Leading with Greatness blog, which is on Substack. I put that on the newsletter, and then I actually link to the recorded version as well. My membership doubled on LinkedIn.
Really?
I have twice as many people on LinkedIn as I do. The numbers are fairly modest, but I have twice as many people on LinkedIn as I do on Substack. And that was like almost overnight, because I do have a lot of people I'm connected with on LinkedIn. Now, whether that was a good idea or not, I don't know, because I'm kind of in two places now. And I was already in two places with a blog and a podcast. So now I'm kind of all over the place. It's very, very hard to count.
Mhm.
But what I do every day is I take my podcast, and I always ask a question. This week I wrote about autocratic bosses, and I said, what's the damage that autocratic bosses do? Might be one of my questions, right? It's always an open-ended question. It's never yes or no. And then I give my title, and I say, listen or read at my on Substack, give the link. I put that on LinkedIn, and I put it in my LinkedIn groups, and I also put it on Facebook, just because I really use Facebook for anything else, but that's what I do. The Dylantantes is totally different, because that is a building community.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a Bob Dylan website that someone has been putting out since, I think, the late 90s, called Expecting Rain. And it's literally a listing of everything that appeared on the web that day about Bob Dylan. People send in the links.
Really?
You put something on there, your readership will jump up, your listenership will jump up instantly. And that's my number one way of promoting that.
Wow, that's awesome. I mean, to have that resource or that place that you can just share stuff with, and again, the name that you're doing this on Bob Dylan, right? So it's really his name that people are kind of like fans of, but your content is about him, and just by sharing it there, it's like they, download it and listen to it. So that's really good that you have that one place that you can go to promote that podcast. That's awesome. But I realized that, so you share you share a link on LinkedIn for your podcast, the written version of your essay, and the audio version, so people can listen to it or read it, whichever they prefer.
And I always say, find it on your favorite podcast platform as well.
Right. And I think that's actually interesting, because so you have identified that, because I think a lot of the questions that people ask is, where is the best place to promote my podcast? Right. But from what you answered, it sounds like the best place for you to promote your podcast is where the people who want to listen to that podcast are.
Precisely.
Right. So for your podcast on Leading with Greatness, most of the people who that podcast is targeted to are found on LinkedIn.
Exactly.
And that's where you post it. That's where you post it, and that's probably where you get most of your traction from. Right. So yeah, the takeaway here. So depending on what your podcast topic is, and this is for everyone else listening, depending on what your topic is, try to find out where the people who are listening to your podcast reside. Where are they most active on social media, whether it is LinkedIn, Instagram, TikTok? Are you on TikTok? No. Okay. Yeah. I don't expect you to be on
I am
TikTok.
aware of it.
You're aware of it. Yes. But you see, I don't expect to hear like you or your podcast topic on TikTok. I expect to hear it on LinkedIn. Right. Because of your topic. Right. So I think as podcasters, we need to be aware of what we're talking about and where would be the best place to promote that podcast. Right. We don't got to splash it everywhere because I think that would be a waste of time if you did that. But
I used to.
Yeah. Well, a lot of people do. A lot of people still do. But if you find out where you can focus your attention and your efforts, you can actually have greater traction and get better results.
Right.
Wonderful, wonderful insight. So we talked about your most downloaded episode. Now, you mentioned earlier that you were a leadership coach. So does your podcast, I'm guessing your podcast is kind of used as a lead generation tool for your coaching, or is there any connection between your podcast and your work?
Ideally, it would be a lead generation tool. It has not been that for me. Now I'm actually promoting a lead generation tool with it, but it hasn't served that purpose for whatever reason. But yeah, it is absolutely integral to my work. The reason I
Okay.
spend so much time on those essays is because this is my philosophy. I have a philosophy of leadership. I lay it out. If you were to ask me questions about leadership, and I'm on podcasts all the time being interviewed about leadership. I was just on one yesterday. I just start riffing, and 90% of what I'm saying comes out of one of my podcasts.
Mhm.
Just things I said, things that I wrote. I wouldn't have had that material otherwise. I'm putting together a book based on all my writings. I'm a speaker, right? I go on stages. My signature talks, two of them are based strictly on some of my podcasts, things I came up with in my podcast. So it is absolutely integral. And then in terms of my coaching, it informs the things I tell my clients, right? I help them out. There's somebody I'm working with right now. I sent him a tool I developed in using one of my podcasts. I emailed it to him. So, I have all these things that are key. It's hard for me to separate that from everything I do. So it's interesting. On the one hand, it's a tremendous waste of time. I spend an outrageous amount of time writing these things and then recording them and editing them and putting them out there and promoting them. And I don't have any direct ROI, right?
Mm.
I'm not putting them out there and getting leads. I'm not having anybody, reach out to me and say, "Oh, I heard your podcast. I want to work with you." Not even close. Never once. But what it does is it's the foundation for every single thing I do.
Got it. Yeah. Wonderful. So maybe if we can just pivot back to what you do when it comes
Yeah.
to leadership. Now, I listened to one of your episodes, and so as I mentioned, I think before we started recording, I'm in technology, so I'm in the corporate world, right? And I hear a lot of like corporate jargon and stuff like that, and I really hate it, because sometimes you mentioned on one of your previous episodes, most recent episode, not the most recent episode, but one that you recently did in the past. I think I can't remember the exact date, but it talks about this. We have to disagree to agree. Can you share a little bit about that episode and what your thought process was with regards to that? Because that's something that, in the corporate world, that we hear that a lot.
Oh, do we? Okay. I didn't know that because like I said, I come from higher ed. I have not heard that. It's funny because that one got a lot of feedback from people who are leadership coaches and whatnot in the corporate world. People seem to think it was a little offbeat. So I'm surprised to hear that. But it's the idea that what I was talking about, and this may not fit exactly with the way you've heard the phrase. What I was talking about was the idea that if you're a leader, you need to encourage dissent, and you need to encourage questions, and people will say they do that, but really you actually need to do that. If you're just saying, if everyone's agreeing all the time, something is grossly wrong.
Something's wrong. Yeah.
Right? And you shouldn't take, if somebody's disagreeing, if they're doing it in a civil way, and it has to be civil, but if they're doing it in a civil way, that's fine. That's constructive.
Mhm.
That should be something that you want to embrace.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. I had a boss one time, and this was basically his philosophy. If there was any problem or anything that we were working out, we get in the room, and if everybody was in agreement, he would stir the pot.
okay.
He would stir the pot and say something or contradict something to stir up some conversation to get people to think differently about it, so that there can be some sort of disagreement, so that we can start to think more critically about what it is, that thing that we're talking about. So he was a really good leader, by the way. He was extremely good leader, to the point where he was not afraid to say things that could be borderline offensive to people to get them talking.
Mm.
So he was, and it was like, it was really close for him, really touch and go sometimes, right? But he got the point across, and he was a really good leader. I'll just share a quick story of something he did. there was a leader that we had, a project leader, and he was responsible for funneling the work that we had to work on as the development team. And he didn't like working with me for whatever reason. So he wanted to, instead of feeding me the work that I needed to do my job, he actually did it himself. And I'm trying to tell him, look, I'm here for that. Can you give it to me? Give it to me. This is my job. This is what I do. But he was holding on to it. By him doing that, doing my work, he was actually holding up his own work. And my boss went up to him very bluntly and point blank, and he said, he did a little calculation afterward. And he says, he did a calculation of how much money everybody on the team was getting paid every single day. And he went up to him and said, this is how much money you're wasting by not giving Chris work.
Yeah.
And if you don't change the way that you're doing this is going to go to your boss.
Wow.
Very direct, very straight. And
I love it.
He justified though. It's justifiable. Like, you're not supposed to be doing something and you're doing it. And my boss, he was a great leader. I'm connected with him on LinkedIn right now. But yeah, great leader. And I enjoyed working. I'm sorry?
Can't tell you how lucky you are.
Yeah, he was a great boss. And he challenged every single one of us to, like you said, if there is just agreement in the room, we're not thinking deeply enough about the situation. We need to go deeper, right? So let's stir the pot a little bit. Let's get into it and see if we can stimulate some new creative ideas by challenging some things right here. And he was really good at doing that. So when I listened to that episode that you did about disagreeing to agree, it brought back memories of him. He was a great leader. Awesome. So I say all that. I don't know if you have any comments that you want to mention.
I do.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Just as a caveat, right? So your boss would come in and sort of play the contrarian to get things going, right?
Exactly.
And that's a dangerous game, and he's a risk taker, and I admire that. Now, I had a boss, a university president. I was a dean, and he would do things like, people would debate, and I mean over months, argue about something, and he would come in and just do the opposite of whatever the advice was or whatever we wanted to do. So you would plan something, you work on it for months and months and months, put it through all these layers of approval and argumentation and this and that, dozens of people involved, and he would come in, you'd show it to him, and he would do the opposite. Now that's a jerk.
Yeah.
Horrible leader.
Oh,
he was
for months.
I make a distinction between a boss and a leader.
Yeah.
He was a boss.
Yeah.
Your boss was actually a leader.
Yes, absolutely. 100% agree. He was a leader. And the thing about it too, yes, his ways were kind of borderline, dangerous, risky. And they actually, my company actually got rid of him after a while, and they suffered as a result of it, because you could see that the team was like, why did they get rid of him? Like, we were just like, he was great. The team suffered as a result of it. And yeah, we weren't the same after that. But yeah, you have to. Anyways, I could go into this more and more and more. We're supposed to be talking about podcasts, but we're talking about your podcast. But what I want to mention to everybody is I put links for your podcast in the description of this episode. So the episode that I'm talking about that Jim did, you can get it by clicking the link in the description, and you can go and listen to that episode in its completion, because yeah, you had a lot of good insights in that episode. And I think there's a lot of things that we can learn about, the corporate world and leaders versus bosses, right? And I think I need to dive into your podcast a little bit more to see what I can learn more, because there's a lot of stuff that you talk about that can be applicable to those of us in corporate America, corporate Canada, or corporate wherever you are, right? That you can apply to your job to help things go a little smoother, right? If you're a leader or if you're under a leader, to how to approach that. So I want to encourage everyone to listen to your podcast. So links in the description if you want to get Jim's podcast.
Yeah,
now,
thank you.
Let's talk about, so if I listen, I usually ask this question to everybody. Okay. So look at this. I have superpowers. Okay. And now, Jim, I'm talking to you. What one thing about podcasting do you want me to change that you absolutely hate? What one thing? I have superpowers and I can do it right now. What is that one thing that you want me to change about podcasting?
Oh, one thing. I mean, there's a number of things. I mean, the easy one is to say, make it take less time to produce something.
Yeah.
But that's kind of not a big deal, really, when you think about it. It's the constant need to figure out the latest thing. Like now, the latest thing is AI, right? We just talked about.
Yes.
I mean, I started out recording on Audacity, which
Mhm.
was a nightmare because I am not a sound engineer. I have no acumen for that at all. I'm not sure I hear things the way other people hear them. And there's so many moving pieces to that. It's a great free software and all, but it was just so many moving pieces. And every time I land on something, something new comes out. It's that constant change. And the same thing with promotion. The way to promote things changes constantly. It's that constant, just as soon as you settle into something, it changes up. And that I would love if I could just have like a steady stream of referrals, maybe people just, sharing my podcast.
That would be nice. Yeah. So I wish I had that power. That would be easy. I think it's interesting that you mentioned though that Audacity everybody has their strengths, I guess, right? Because from an audio background, I love editing podcasts. You probably hate it, but
No, I don't mind it, but that was just overwhelming.
it
That
was
was
overwhelming. Okay. Okay. Because a lot of podcasts, Audacity is one of the popular tools that a lot of podcasters use because it's free. And I think I've never used it, but I've heard that a lot of people, it's a good entry level tool to get into podcasting, and it gets the job done. So I think it's very popular for those reasons. But yeah, if I guess some people may not, like in your case, you couldn't handle Audacity. So what do you use now to record your podcast?
Well, like I said, I've been experimenting with the script, but I also have been using a iOS-based recorder and editor called Ferrite, which is very simple to use. And it has, pretty basic tools. That's the problem with Audacity. I mean, you can do the basic thing with Audacity and it's fine, but if you want to try to beef up the sound or anything,
Yeah.
you find yourself going down a rabbit hole of videos to watch and this and that. And then you find out, oh, this one's actually 3 years old and it doesn't do that anymore, that kind of thing.
Mm.
Ferrite is a much cleaner, simpler tool to use, and the editing's very easy in it.
Ferrite. How do you spell that? I've never heard of that one before.
Ferrite.
Okay, cool. I'm going to check that one out because I'm always looking for new tools and new things out there to, again, help other people, maybe help myself to, get better at what I do when it comes to podcasting. So that's good. Now,
And it only works on iOS though. It's only like
iOS. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So when it comes to your tools that you use for your podcast in terms of, so we talked about some of the software, like you use Descript and this other tool that you mentioned. In terms of hardware, like what does your setup look like in terms of your microphone or your interface or what you're using for your podcast?
So I record either, if I'm using Ferrite, I record on my iPad or an iPad Pro. Otherwise, I use my computer if I'm doing the script. And right now I'm on the computer. It depends on where I recorded. So right now, the sound probably isn't great, and I apologize for that. And the reason is because I'm in a room, it's basically an office, and it's not set up for sound recording, but it has a really nifty background, which happens to be a big bookcase.
Bookcase, yeah.
But otherwise, I record in my basement under the stairs. I have a
Oh,
bunch of
really? Eh?
moving blankets from when we moved. The movers left behind a bunch of them, and I have that surrounded the room, and I have like a carpet on the floor, and the sound's pretty good in there, but it's tight. It's hard to move. And it's not the prettiest space. I put up a green screen. So sometimes I project and that's where I record the Dylantantes, and that's where I record audio, strictly audio.
Mhm.
But I use a snowball microphone, which is pretty basic. I'm looking to upgrade that. In terms of a camera, I just use a Logitech, a cheap one that's a very well known. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
Interesting. So you're not the first person that uses moving blankets to help deaden the sound in the room. You're not the first person that has told me that. So that's something that I think maybe there is something that out there that everybody knows that moving blankets, when they are moving, they should try to swipe them from the moving company to use it for their podcast. But you're not
I didn't steal them.
Okay. I'm not saying you did. It was forgotten, air quotes.
I had a few watches disappear, so I think it was a fair trade.
Fair trade. Okay.
They got cheap watches. I got cheap blankets.
Yeah. But it's interesting though, because a lot of people think that in order to start a podcast that you need to have like the foam panels on the wall behind you. be in like a soundproof room and, this and that, and the expensive microphone and whatnot. And I'll tell you a story. I spoke to a podcast and I released this episode end of March with, her name is Dawn Wecker. And I have mentioned this a couple times on the podcast because it totally blew me away. I interviewed her and I was asking her the same question about her setup, what she uses for her podcast. Her podcast is called Dawnversations. Now, it blew me away. So as I mentioned, I have an audio background. So I have really good ears for like good audio quality. So like if someone is using like, a cell phone microphone or their earbuds to record their podcast, I can tell. Right. But she said to me that she has more than 300 episodes, but she was using her cell phone, just like her cell phone, like to her face like this for more than 2 years. And the audio quality, like when I listened to it, I could not tell. But that shows me that she was using really good technique when she was recording. And she said that she wasn't using any AI processing after the fact. She was recording in a closet with her cell phone. And I was just blown away with the quality of audio that she was able to get from herself. So I say all that to say this, that even though, yes, the expensive mics and, name brand mics out there, absolutely, if you want to get one of those mics to do your podcast, it will make a difference in how you sound. It will make you sound like a professional radio show host, right? But if you can only afford the cost-efficient version of a microphone, under $100 or whatever USB microphone you can get, it's better to practice good technique with recording into a normal microphone than getting the most expensive microphone and not practice good technique, because your audio is still going to be kind of trash, even though you have a really expensive microphone. So that's just my 2 cents on that. So the Snowball microphone is something that is really popular with podcasters as well. Kind of entry level, I think. A lot of people start with that microphone. And right now, like hearing you, I don't really hear much of I hear a little bit of the room, but not too much from your microphone. So it's not much of a big deal.
They're doing construction outside.
And I don't hear any of that, right? So I don't hear any of that, right? So which is good. And that shows you that you can get good sound and audio from, decent price point microphone. And again, there's a lot of AI tools that can actually take out background noises from your audio. So you don't need to spend that much money on your podcast.
Yeah.
On the microphone, on the tools that you're using. Okay, cool. So let's wrap this up. Now,
sure.
I usually ask this and leave it open for the guest that I'm speaking to. Jim, is there anything that I forgot to ask you about podcasting that you want to share?
Monetizing.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about it.
And this is interesting. So like I said, I use Substack for both my podcasts. That's my basis. Substack has a monetizing component. I did actually have my archives of my On Leading with Greatness behind a paywall for a while, but then I started taking that down because it seemed counterproductive. Only one person ever paid me. And thank you, Chris, for that. But the other one, the Dylantantes, I've never put anything behind a paywall until recently. And people started paying me spontaneously. And now we're not talking thousands. We're talking, a few $100s here and there. But it did allow me to do things like upgrade to the script and start using that.
Right.
I'll probably buy a nicer microphone now. I'll probably get some decent headphones that I could use and start just upgrading my equipment. And I can justify that because I'm getting a little money in my pocket. Right. So, if you hear something you like, pay for it. Even if it's just a few bucks a month, it really can make a difference. It's a difference between, nothing and something that the podcaster feels appreciated, but also you can improve the podcast. Now I'm also the Dylantantes. I should bring this up because it's a bit of a big deal. There is a new network of podcasts called FM Podcast started by a buddy of mine, Craig Daniloff, who's a big Dylan podcaster. He started something called Dylan FM, and then it became FM Pods. And a bunch of Dylan podcasts, and there are a bunch of us, started working under that aegis as a network. So FM Pods is a network, and he's expanding that into other music now. So
wonderful. So is that just a resource for music podcasts, or is that
it's all music podcasts? And so right now they're almost all Dylan. I think there's one Steely Dan one or something, and maybe another. But he's expanding that quite a. I know he's looking at a Joni Mitchell podcast. And that's really an interesting model, because what we're doing is we put some stuff behind a paywall, and his argument is that we're not going to make big bucks on this. Maybe down the line he will, I don't know, somebody will, but the podcasters themselves get a few bucks in their pockets.
Right.
And again, that helps upgrade.
It's something.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I'm wondering actually if that model can be used in other areas as well. I'm pretty sure it can, or I'm pretty sure it probably does exist other places as well.
Yeah.
Probably just need to find it. FM pods, interesting. I've never heard of that one, but I'm going to look it up and see what I can learn about it.
It's relatively young.
Wonderful. Okay, cool. So that was great. I don't have any other questions for you. Jim, you've been great. Thank you for coming on I Made a Podcast. And yeah, monetization, very important. If you want to see if you can make some money with your podcast, yes, look into ways that you can do it. I'm sorry I didn't ask that before. I should have, but my bad. Anyways, yeah, exactly. Thank you. So Jim, thank you very much for being on I Made a Podcast. So again, your podcasts are called On Leading with Greatness and the Dylantantes. Did I pronounce that right?
Dylantantes, yeah.
Yes. Okay, good.
Dylantantes.
Wonderful. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to put links for all your stuff in the description of this episode. So if anybody heard anything that they loved that we talked about today and want to listen to more, go listen to the links in the description and listen to Jim's podcast. And again, Jim, thank you so much for being on I Made a Podcast.
Thank you for having me, Chris. This has been great.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right. That's another episode of I Made a Podcast that is complete. And it was a great conversation. Now, if you want to listen to more of Jim's podcast that we spoke about in this episode, I put links in the description. You can follow his links and get to his podcast, get to his socials, and connect with him there. I've also put a link for my podcasting cheat sheet. It's in the description. So go there, click on the links, and you can follow that and get access to the cheat sheet that I've created to help you become a better podcaster. Now, I Made a Podcast is on all of the major podcasting apps. So just search I Made a Podcast or follow the links that I have in the description for the podcast, and you can subscribe and follow this podcast. And what I'm asking you to do is if you can put a 5-star rating on whichever app that you're using and write a review if it allows you to enter comments on that rating. So write a review so that other people can know that I Made a Podcast is a great podcast and they can listen to it and expect to learn a lot. And I am really grateful if you will do that for me. Now, remember, the best time to start a podcast was 10 years ago. The second best time is right now. So go ahead and make it happen. And I'm here to help you. So you'll hear from me again next week on I Made a Podcast. Peace.